Thank you again for agreeing to be interviewed after I went and lost the first interview, or most of it. We'd talked about what your job entails, what you did before, and what we'd got up to was, or where the previous film cuts out. I asked you about your research into why people go to church. And could you recap what your research was, what you found?
Yeah, I was interested in why people go to church, and particularly noticing that in the Church of England there's a lot of people who go to church occasionally, or a lot of people who have a sense of belonging with their church but who are not part of the regular Sunday morning congregation. You discover that if you try to move a pew or alter something in the churchyard. And so by observing churchgoers, I developed a model and then tested it statistically, and it looks at the way that people belong in 4 different dimensions, through the kind of things we do regularly, the activities that there's a sense if you go to one there's a commitment to going next time, or if not that, the time after. Then there's kind of events, one-off things. There's always been a lot of one-off events in the life of the church, and they can be things like baptisms and weddings, but also Harvest Festival, carol services, Christingle services, things that happen sufficiently infrequently that there's no real sense that if you go one time that you're bound to go on the next occasion. And for some people, belonging is more through human relationships. I had a wonderful church warden in one village where I was the vicar, who people just felt close to God when they were close to her, and somehow she mediated an important dimension of people's religious experience in that village. And then for some people it is the place, the location. When I came back to Manchester, I began the day of my first proper day in the diocese actually at my great-grandparents' grave, and then when my parents' ashes were buried, and then the font where I was baptised as a child. And that church, that place, that churchyard are hallowed in my memory because they're where my family have had their significant events for well over 100 years.
And will that research be published?
A very brief summary of some of it was published in the Church Times last weekend. There are thoughts of potentially turning some of it into a longer book if I have the time to do so.
And will that research that you've undertaken change anything about the way that you practice, or maybe the way the church more broadly practices?
Well, it already has changed the way in which I practice. It means that when I'm thinking about how we engage with church life, I, both as an individual but also the advice I give to clergy and to church councils and others who are responsible for the church in their own locality, is to be aware of these different ways in which people belong, and to provide, in the range of things the church does, a programme of stuff that actually appeals to all those 4 different dimensions. There's things that the person who is deeply attached to the place will do, but the person who's more interested in people will be less interested in. And I think we can produce in each parish a varied programme of church life that appeals to all of those 4 different dimensions of belonging. Because all of us experience them to some extent, but each individual, I guess, different ones are predominant and others are slightly more on the back seat.
And presumably that will change perhaps through the course of a person's life as well.
I think it will indeed. I mean, people, the longer they're in a particular place, for example, that the more particular connections there might be to that church building or that churchyard. And again, that the significant people who come into our lives maybe become very important to our religious identity. So yes, so things will change, and sometimes pressures on young families make it difficult to commit to going to church on a regular basis, but they still hold on to those special events and those personal relationships and the particular place to sustain them when they can't go to the Sunday morning communion service or the monthly family service on a regular basis.
There's a quote I like from an Australian cultural theorist called Mackenzie Wark, where he says, "We no longer have roots, we have antennas." And I wonder if some of them almost mindless consumption that you sometimes see, shopping for its own sake, retail therapy, is connected to a sense of loneliness or disconnection, either from other people or from nature.
I think the degree of loneliness and disconnection in modern life should not be underestimated. I think it's one of the most profound problems of our society, of our day and age, that people struggle to make and sustain commitments because everything is so transient, so temporary. And compare that with even a century ago, when people were largely born, brought up, lived, worked, had their families, died in the same small community. And so how we cope with the sheer transience in modern life is I think, yes, it's a huge, major issue. Religious faith for me will be an important part of the response to that, because whilst everything else is transient and changing, we're told as Christians that God remains changeless at the heart of it all, and if we can locate ourselves in relationship to that eternal changelessness, then I think that strengthens us to cope with the very rapid change that we have in our lives nowadays. And for me, that's expressed not least through my Franciscan identity.
Ooh, great. Last time we spoke, I asked you about examples of leadership that you can point to in the church and beyond. And it doesn't have to be leadership purely on climate change issues. I would like you to talk about leadership on sort of anti-poverty or social justice issues as well as climate. Can you point to some examples, please?
Yeah. I'm beginning there with issues around climate change. And what the church can do, and I think does do well, is what I've always called prophetic action. Prophetic action is saying, this is the way the world ought to be. We can't necessarily jump straight there from where we are, but we can create living examples of how things should be. The diocese I was in before I came to Manchester, we built 2 new vicarages to the German Passive House standard, and we offset all the carbon that was used up in their construction at the time of construction. The cathedral here in Manchester has recently had a new floor put in and a new ground heat sourced heating system as part of that, so that only a tiny amount of heat at the coldest times of the year now has to be added through non-renewable resources. So I think there are things that we can do as examples, saying this is the direction in which we must move, even if we can't jump the whole of society to there instantly. But more generally, the church speaks prophetically into situations that affect human life and affect the world around us. And so I've done quite a lot of work over the years around poverty, seeking to help churches to engage practically with questions of poverty, whether that's through setting up food banks, credit unions. I was spent a morning last week with a group of homeless men who'd spent the night in a church, and the church provided them with an evening meal, a bed for the night, breakfast, fresh clothing if they wanted that, and then the following night another church would take over. So all the way through the winter months in Manchester there's a relay of churches who are providing accommodation overnight for those who otherwise might end up sleeping on the streets. So there's lots of ways in which we can engage with poverty issues, working with asylum seekers. I spent time with the Boas Trust, who work in the Manchester area in conjunction in certain parts with the diocese, where we've made spare vicarages available to them to house families, to see that those who've often got no benefits at all or virtually none, to see again that they're provided with somewhere to sleep, they've got food to eat, and they've got warmth, clothing, and they're learning English and discovering how to live in this society.
Could you explain a little bit more about what the Boas Trust is and what it does, because not everyone watching the video will know?
Yeah. The Boas Trust works out of offices just off Oldham Road in Manchester, and it's primarily working with those people who have made an asylum claim when they've come to the UK, so they believe that they are in danger if they return back to their home country, But often those claims, when they're initially dealt with, are not dealt with very well. Often people don't get the quality of legal advice that they need to work their way through the complications that is the UK immigration system. And so they get very rapidly turned down, they don't have the right papers or whatever. And then they have to go to some sort of appeal. And nowadays, during that period of appealing against an adverse asylum decision, they're not entitled to any kind of state support. And so it's working with those people, and considerable numbers of them do eventually win their appeal, which I think does show us that the original decision was wrong. That's what a successful appeal means. But all through that intervening period of time, which may be months or even years in some cases, they're reliant entirely on charity to support them. And so that's the kind of work the Boas Trust does. And alongside providing help for people in pursuing their legal appeal, as I said, it's keeping body and soul together during that period of time, but also helping them with things like English lessons. So again, if somebody's going to engage with the English legal system, they need to probably have a better quality of English than they had when they arrived.
And please don't be insulted by this question, but the work that you do with the Boas Trust, I mean, you presumably lots of these people who are refugees are Muslims or Hindus, or and that makes no odds to the support the church provides.
We work with people of all faiths and none. I mean, I was fascinated when I spent a morning joining in with English lessons that the Boas Trust were giving. Got into a wonderful conversation with a Muslim refugee who wanted to know all about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity and how that related to his understanding of God in a very monotheistic religion and culture. We don't discriminate in terms of to whom God's love extends. God loves the whole of his creation. We believe as Christians that it says God so loved the world that he sent his son Jesus Christ. Not God loves some people, but God loved the world. And so we try to live that out in our lives.
What would you say to a Christian who came to you and said, well, look, it says in Genesis that we were given this to dominate. So it doesn't really matter that species are dying out and the planet's getting hotter, because God gave us this to dominate, and he has a plan anyway, so everything will be okay.
There are a minority, and this is quite a small minority of Christians who sincerely believe that the world is simply ours to dominate, and in fact some would even argue that the quicker we use up its resources, the quicker Jesus Christ will return to take us into God's kingdom. It has to be said that is not the substantial opinion of the vast majority of Christians around the world. When we look at the book of Genesis, we don't see ourselves being given ownership of the world to exploit for our own ends. We see ourselves being given stewardship of the world. The world remains God's. We are the stewards of his creation. We're called, as all stewards are, to look after something that is not ours to waste because it isn't our property. It's ours to take care of and to see that it's passed on or handed back to its owner in as good a condition as we received it. And so as Christians, I think the vast majority of us see we have a real duty to care for the earth, to see it as the creation that God said was good when he first made it, and in all that we do to seek to encourage its diversity, to encourage its flourishing, and to speak out against those things that would denigrate the earth or destroy it.
That's just a low battery, but we've got that, that's fine. When I asked you this question last time, you mentioned St. Francis of Assisi. Could you say a little bit about who he was and why he matters?
Yes, St. Francis of Assisi is a quite amazing person. He was born in the late part of the 12th century in the town whose name he is often associated with. At a time when Europe was opening up as a major trading route. It was coming out of the Dark Ages, and people were beginning to travel around, and business was flourishing, and his dad was a wealthy cloth merchant. And Francis, I guess, saw perhaps more of the world than previous generations would have done, and became convinced that the world was God's good creation, and that we need to live rather gently on it and to treat all God's creatures with respect. That was part of his discovery. He embraced a very radical poverty for himself and his close followers. I think finding that in that they weren't kind of disrespecting the creation, but reverencing it even more. Again, denying themselves ownership of any part of it in order to more fully see it as God's gift. And so Francis famously, if he was walking along a footpath and he saw a worm along the path, he'd pick it up and move it to the side so that nobody would tread on it. And he taught his followers to have that high degree of reverence for all that God has made, to see it as good and to treat it respectfully.
Put yourself in St. Francis's shoes. This morning on the radio, you're hearing the BBC report the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And the journalist says, this isn't just about birds and butterflies anymore, this is about humans. What would you say as St. Francis?
Well, I think St. Francis, understood as Christians always have, that humans have a very special place in God's creation. We are those made, we believe, particularly in God's likeness, and part of God's likeness is to be creative ourselves. But also we're made as stewards of that creation and given a particular responsibility for the rest of it. When the various creatures are presented to Adam in the Genesis story, they're presented to him for him to have a responsibility to take care of them. And so that's St. Francis understood. That's part of how we respond. And yes, the impact on the climate of humanity is in two ways. I mean, firstly, changes of the climate impact on human beings, and if we lose some of the birds and the butterflies, then we will lose part of the food chain of which we were a necessary part ourselves. We will lose some of what we needed to sustain our own lives. But also, I guess we're part of the problem and the solution, in that it's now undeniable, unless you really are determined to refuse the evidence that's staring you in the face. It's undeniable now that much of the climate change around us is man-made. This is human impact on the world around us. This isn't purely the cyclical nature of climate and weather with ice ages and warmer periods. This is now, if you look at what's been happening in the last 150, a couple of hundred years, clearly industrialised human civilization is impacting on the environment in a way it never has before, and potentially destabilising systems that have had an equilibrium for many hundreds of thousands and millions of years.
Back to the leadership question. What sorts of things has the church been doing to lead on climate change? You already mentioned sort of Passive House here in Manchester. And I'm particularly interested in what things has the church not been doing as well as it could? Because I'm quite a negative person and this is ostensibly an interview.
I mean, churches, like other organisations, are better at doing things that don't cost them a lot of money here and now. And so we're quite good at things. If we're told, well, we can change to a light bulb that uses less energy and that'll cut our fuel bills immediately, we're quite good at doing that. We're reasonably good in churches at recycling. Not as good as in some other parts of Europe, but we're reasonably good at recycling. We're less good at things that involve us changing our habits in ways that we would see as reducing our freedom of choice or our standard of living. I think there are questions to be asked about the way in which we use our cars. People on the whole travel by car to church on a Sunday morning. It's not helped by the fact that that's the one day of the week when public transport is least reliable and least frequent. But we are finding that as, I think that's a major issue. We do have problems that many of our churches are large and difficult to heat buildings, and yet people, understandably in this day and age, won't put on 3 overcoats and come to worship if it's freezing cold in the place. So we know we have to give people literally a warm welcome but that has a huge impact then in terms of the fossil fuels that we're often burning to get those churches up to an acceptable warmth on a Sunday morning in the winter months. So I think we're struggling to find ways of tackling those questions.
When I interviewed you last time, the now lost interview, I asked you potentially a cheeky question. I said, would Jesus fly? And you replied, part of your answer, which I had transcribed, we've moved to a position where it seems the answer to people's desire to fly is to create more airports or extend airports. And I really don't think that's the way forward. A certain amount of flying will be essential in our society, but there's an awful lot of places we can get to without that. Now, I suppose now's my opportunity to confess. I'm going to go to Australia later this year to visit my family. Is that a sin? And if it's not a sin, does that mean I can do it every year? And if it is a sin, what should I do about it? And what do you do about your flying?
I think, with almost any moral decision that we have to make in this life, there's a kind of degree of proportionality that's involved, and so clearly there's a good to be gained in sustaining family relationships across large distances, and while we can do a certain amount, no doubt, with the internet or Skype or just long distance telephone calls, there's actually nothing that replaces face-to-face human encounter. And that's built into the Christian tradition as it is into most religious and secular traditions too. And so if we're going to sustain networks and relationships, from time to time we have to do that face to face. And that involves all of us, whether it's for family reasons or sometimes for work reasons, to travel intercontinentally. It's not practical to do that other than flights. To actually get a boat to Australia and get a boat back again would be weeks and weeks out of your life, and few of us could sustain that economically. And so we do, I think many of us find from time to time that we are travelling by air. What I would argue is that we should only do that when there is no alternative, and we should be clear that the good that's being done from that is so great as to offset the impact of flying on the wider environment. When I'm travelling around Europe these days, I try, if at all possible, to go by land. And I had a salutary experience 4 years ago when, having flown out to Rome to take part in an international conference, an Icelandic volcano erupted and left us having to come back via train. It was a little bit more expensive, but actually it was a much nicer journey. And the next time we had to do a conference in another part of Europe, I booked all our delegates to go via the Eurostar and to travel across Europe by train. And we found the journey itself was an important time of getting to know each other better, being face to face as we were travelling, as well as face to face when we got to our conference, was quite a big bonus. So I'm a great advocate for land travel, for train travel where we can do that, but recognise that if we're going to sustain a certain level of networks and relationships from time to time, that will involve us in flight. But yeah, don't go flying to Australia every year. I don't think your family relationships probably need that degree of flight, even if your budget could sustain it.
Exactly that. I'm just paranoid about the rec button because we've lost that now, if that's fine. Beyond the church's infrastructure, its buildings, its light bulbs, the way that people get there and what they do when they're there, I'm interested in the cultural aspect or the intellectual aspect, what happens in the buildings. What about sort of sermons and writings and engaging in dialogues with parishioners? Can you point to examples of what the Church of England is doing around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would find in most churches at some point during the course of the year there'd be a number of occasions on which issues around the wider environment, our care for it, sustainability, climate, came up in sermons. They would come up in the prayers that people were offering, and the prayers in Church of England churches on a Sunday morning are usually offered by an individual on behalf of the whole congregation, so different voices will be heard during the course of the year presenting those prayers. So I think you'll find those sorts of concerns and Christian teaching on the environment will come out through those kind of occasions. In addition to that, clearly there are the wider public pronouncements that the bishops and archbishops and others can make, and the particular activities that can be encouraged. We do have people responsible at national level for the church and to help us to think about how we engage with issues like climate change and the wider environment. And they produce initiatives and again teaching materials that churches can use from time to time.
Worst case scenario, you've got someone in a leadership position in a local church who's a bit of a skeptic, referring back to the sort of, we're here to dominate, God has a plan thing. Is there any monitoring or sanctioning going on even of how much individual parishes are doing on climate education and climate dialogue?
I think an important part of the Church of England's structure, its polity, is that individual clergy and individual parishes have a considerable degree of independence. My role as the bishop is firstly to be the outward-facing kind of public dimension of that with wider society, and then to generally oversee and encourage churches to take on healthy ways of ministering and engaging with their parishioners and with the wider world around them. But I don't have, and I don't think I should have, power to kind of intervene in a traditionally hierarchical way and say to people, you mustn't do that, you mustn't preach that, you must preach this instead. I think that would be rather top down for my understanding the way in which the church needs to operate on this and on many wider issues too. And so I have a certain amount of influence, and I'm happy to use that influence and to use it fairly strongly, but I think that is properly as far as it goes. And I would expect that if a particular vicar in a parish is a very strong sceptic on matters around climate change, then maybe it's for their parishioners to take those matters up with them and to challenge them on those areas of their thinking and teaching. Recently,
some of us wrote an open letter to Manchester City Council on its climate change actions, calling for the council to engage in 9 different things. And part of the response we got was, "Oh, you mustn't tell people how to behave." Anyway, one of the demands one of the requests in that those 9 actions was around this notion of a low carbon culture. Manchester City Council worked with other stakeholders in 2009, came up with the Climate Change Action Plan. One of the 2 headline goals is the creation of a low carbon culture. And we now ask everyone that we interview, what does the term low carbon culture mean to you, and how would we know if we were living in it?
Yeah. I think low carbon culture is a very clear and very, very powerful phrase. There's a lovely saying that's quite popular nowadays. It says, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I think we have to recognise, unless we change culture, then we won't ever have the strategies in place that will deliver the outcomes. But culture is very hard to change, and so whether it's more widely when I'm engaging with the church about the culture within the church or with the culture in society around Greater Manchester, it's identifying where are those areas where we can go with the grain of the culture of a particular city or a particular community, to accentuate the positive aspects of that culture and pray that in aid of the strategies that we then want to put in place. And so we're looking at things in the culture of Manchester, that Manchester has always been, as the first ever industrialised city in the world, I think Manchester has always liked to see itself as cutting edge. And so if we want a culture around being low carbon, we have to demonstrate that we're appealing to that aspect of Manchester society. Manchester has always been a culture of embracing diversity and welcoming difference. and so I think we can work with that and say low carbon is a new and a different way of being, and appeal to that openness within Manchester society to explore and to welcome different ways of living and being. So I think there's a number of ways in which the culture of Manchester, built up over recent centuries, can be brought to bear to then produce what you might call a low carbon strategy. But the culture is important, but you need to go with what the underlying culture is. You won't just change the culture overnight.
I really like Culture Eats strategy for breakfast. I'm going to start using that. On the subject of adaptation and impacts and vulnerabilities, and we've recently seen flooding, and there's down south, the church's role in helping people in extremis, in disaster situations, flooding, heat waves, etc. You mentioned, could you recap what you said last time, which was around where you previously worked and your previous experiences and what the church is involved in?
I mean, the church is located in every community in this country, and that's part of the Church of England's understanding of its role. And because it's located everywhere, that means that wherever some crisis happens, some disaster occurs, then there is a local church with a vicar who has some skills and ability and experience, with buildings, and with the structures of volunteers and people who are used to sitting on committees and holding meetings, all that available at quite local level in every parish across the country. So when there's a major event, whether it's a climate event or whatever it is, then the church is on hand to respond rapidly and locally. So for example, when in, I think it was July of 2007, there was very major flooding in Worcestershire, where I was before I came back to Manchester. I think within about 4 hours an unprecedented amount of rain fell. Many roads were completely swamped, people were abandoning cars, unable to complete journeys. It was church halls and church buildings that were opened up. Food and warm clothing was gotten to people, so they could, at least that first night, there was somewhere immediately for them to go where they could be safe from the weather, which was still pretty foul outside. Then the churches can be places where people are evacuated to, sometimes for a little bit longer, until the emergency services kick in with longer term responses. So the church has always had a role, whether it's a natural disaster, or hardly dare say an act of God, or whether it's something like a plane crash or a major pile-up on a motorway, that the churches are often the most immediately available local structures to kind of respond and provide that immediate response.
You also mentioned something about flu pandemics last time, which I found interesting.
Yes, I mean, churches we're part of the response system, and we're part of preparing for whatever events might happen, and even part of times of rehearsing of what a disaster recovery would mean. So again, in my previous diocese at one point, when there was a fear of a major flu pandemic at a level which could mean that a large number of the workforce were sick and a significant number of extra deaths were occurring. This even meant having clergy rehearsing what would be done about mass burials if there was a large number of people died of a flu epidemic all at once, and there were most of the undertaker staff and grave diggers for the local authorities were also, many of them were sick too. How would you cope in that very immediate crisis? And so yes, these things are kind of rehearsed and practiced to see the different bits of the system will work together. You never quite know until the incident happens, and we pray to God that these things never will happen. But praying that something won't happen doesn't mean that you don't prepare for what you'd have to do if it did. So just being aware that disasters will happen. We can't predict where and when and what nature they'll be. But as far as possible, the church is being part of the resilience that we need in society to respond to those tragedies, whether it's say, a plane crash or a major epidemic of a new flu variant with a relatively high mortality factor.
It's 2026, your retirement party. Manchester citizens are much more aware of climate change, they're capable of dealing with disasters, and people are looking at the Church of England more generally and also in Manchester and say, we couldn't have done it without you because you...
I think because we were pioneers, because whether it's about practical action or whether it's about developing the ways of thinking around climate or whether it's the ways of nudging the culture in the right directions, that we were always prepared to be at the forefront and prepared to give a lead, to put from time to time our money where our mouth was, and to use the huge amount of people we've got who associate, who belong with the church in any of the four ways I've spoken of, to mobilise that huge number of people to just take those decisions that have made Manchester, the city and the greater Manchester area, more low carbon, sustainably low carbon, and to do it in ways, I would hope by 2026, that have been, as Manchester has often been, a sign to the wider world that what we do first in Manchester then becomes what's done throughout the rest of the world in due course.
And speaking truth to power as well, though.
Speaking truth to power is important because they're very powerful influences that would have things stay the way that they are. And short-term economics is always a very powerful factor, or we have to accept, we will have to accept that we will not grow our own lifestyles as rapidly if we're being low carbon as we might in the short term grow them if we're being high carbon. But if we're wanting sustainable lifestyles for our children and our grandchildren and generations yet to come, then we cannot do that and burn up the planet at the rate we have been doing.